The rifle shot sent dust flying from the wooden post just 6 inches from Hope Miller's head. She didn't flinch. She couldn't. Her entire future depended on standing perfectly still, like a statue carved from fear, while the whole town of Copper Springs watched. It was April 1875. Hope was 22 years old, and this was not the life she had imagined. She was a mail-order bride that nobody wanted. "Last chance," Sheriff Burke's voice boomed across the dusty town square. He was a big man, but his voice sounded tired. "This here mail-order bride needs a husband, or she's on tomorrow's stage back east." He gestured toward Hope with a sweep of his hat. "Her intended, Walter Jenkins, has passed on. God rest his soul, but the fare's been paid. Any man here willing to take her as his lawful wife?" Hope felt her cheeks burn with a heat that had nothing to do with the Colorado sun. Humiliation was a physical thing, a weight pressing down on her shoulders. Just 2 weeks ago, she'd stepped off that stagecoach in her best dress, a worn but clean blue calico. In her hand, she'd clutched a letter from Mr. Jenkins, a shopkeeper who'd promised her a good home, a respectable life, a world away from the crowded, dirty tenements of Boston. Instead of a groom, she'd found a town in mourning. Walter Jenkins had died 3 days before she arrived. The official story was that he'd been trampled by his own spooked horse. A freak accident, they called it. The townspeople had been kind enough at first. They put her up at the boarding house, gave her meals, and whispered about her situation in hushed tones. This public spectacle, this auction of a woman, was their final desperate solution. Hope stared straight ahead, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. She refused to meet the eyes of the men shuffling their feet in the dirt. She wasn't ugly, she knew that. She had chestnut hair that caught the sun, and eyes as blue as a mountain lake. But a wife was a risk. A stranger was a bigger one. "No takers?" Sheriff Burke asked, his voice laced with impatience. "She can cook, she can clean. Comes with a small dowry from her late father." A few cruel snickers rippled through the crowd. Hope's heart, which had been hammering against her ribs, began to sink. Going back wasn't an option. Returning to Boston meant disgrace. It meant returning to her leering cousin, the man who had made her life a living hell after her parents died. This was more than just an auction for a husband. This was an auction for her life. The sheriff sighed, a puff of dust rising from his chest. "Nobody? Well then, Miss Miller, I reckon—" "She's mine." The voice cut through the murmuring crowd like a razor. It was deep, rough, and carried an authority that made everyone fall silent. Hope dared to turn her head. A tall man was stepping forward from the back of the crowd. He was covered in dust, from his wide-brimmed hat to his worn leather boots. A week's worth of beard obscured the bottom half of his face, but his eyes were as green as summer grass, and they were locked onto hers with an intensity that stole her breath. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. He moved with a quiet confidence, a predator's grace. This was not a man who shuffled his feet. This was a man who planted them. "She's mine," he repeated, his voice even firmer this time. "Forever." The word hung in the air, heavy and final. Hope felt a tremor run through her. He wasn't just claiming a wife. He was claiming her. "And who might you be, mister?" Sheriff Burke asked, his hand instinctively moving closer to the pistol on his hip. He was eyeing the stranger with deep suspicion. The man stopped a few feet from the platform. He reached up and removed his hat, revealing thick, sandy hair that the sun had bleached in streaks. "Garrett Lawson," he said. His eyes never left Hope's face. "I have a cattle ranch 10 miles north of here. Been meaning to find myself a wife." He paused, and a ghost of a smile touched his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Seems like today's the day." Hope studied him, her mind racing. He wasn't handsome like the men back in Boston, with their soft hands and tailored suits. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind. He looked to be about 30, with lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting into the horizon, not from laughter. But there was a raw power to him, a magnetism that was both terrifying and compelling. Sheriff Burke turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Miss Miller, do you accept Mr. Lawson's proposal?" This was it, a choice between the devil she knew back in Boston and this dark, dusty stranger. Walter Jenkins had been a man of words on paper, promises of a quiet life. This man, Garrett Lawson, was flesh and blood and grit, standing before her, claiming her with a single possessive word. He had the courage to step forward when no one else would. That had to count for something. Right? "Yes," she said, and her voice was a surprise, stronger than she felt. "I accept." A ragged cheer went up from the crowd, a sound born more of relief than celebration. The town's problem was solved. Hope Miller was no longer their burden. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado," the sheriff declared, eager to be done with it all, "I pronounce you man and wife. You can make it official with Preacher Wilson tomorrow, but this'll do for now." Garrett Lawson gave a single, sharp nod. He stepped onto the small platform. Up close, he was even more intimidating. He smelled of leather, horse, and the vast open prairie. A wild, untamed scent. "Got your things?" he asked, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. "At the boarding house," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Let's get them, then." He offered her his arm. It was a surprisingly formal gesture from a man who looked like he'd just wrestled a bear. Hope took it. She could feel the hard muscle beneath his dusty shirt sleeve. As they walked through the town, the whispers followed them like a trail of smoke. She had just married a man she didn't know, a man who had appeared from the dust and shadows to claim her. She didn't know if he was her savior or something else entirely. And as his grip tightened ever so slightly on her arm, she had a sinking feeling that the answer was far more complicated than she could ever imagine. The room at Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house was small and stuffy. It held everything Hope owned in the world. A single trunk of clothes, her mother's Bible, and a small wooden box of sewing supplies. Garrett Lawson stood in the doorway, filling it completely. His presence seemed to shrink the already tiny room. "That's all?" he asked, his green eyes scanning her meager possessions. He lifted the trunk with one hand as if it weighed nothing. "Yes," Hope said, clutching the Bible to her chest like a shield. "I travel light." Something flickered in his eyes. It might have been approval, or maybe something else. "Good. It's a long ride." Outside, a sturdy bay horse waited patiently. Garrett secured her trunk behind the saddle with a few quick, efficient movements. There was no wasted motion in this man. Everything he did was deliberate, precise. "Can you ride?" he asked, turning back to her. "Not really. In Boston, I mostly walked." He nodded, as if this was the answer he expected. "You'll ride with me, then. I'll send someone for the rest of my supplies tomorrow." Before she could process what he'd said, he'd lifted her onto the horse's back. His hands were strong and sure on her waist. Then, in one fluid motion, he swung up behind her. His chest was a wall of heat against her back. His arms encircled her as he took the reins, caging her in. Hope sat ramrod straight, her body rigid with tension. She wasn't used to being this close to any man, let alone a complete stranger she had just been forced to marry. "Relax," he murmured, his voice a low vibration near her ear. The warmth of his breath sent a shiver down her spine. "The horse can feel it." She tried to force the stiffness from her shoulders, but it was impossible. The intimacy of their position, the raw masculine scent of him, the sheer power radiating from his body. It was all too much. As they rode out of Copper Springs, she saw the faces of the townspeople watching them go. The women's expressions were a mixture of pity and a strange, morbid curiosity. They were watching a lamb being led to the slaughter. Hope lifted her chin and stared straight ahead at the endless expanse of rolling hills and pine trees. She would not let them see her fear. They rode in silence for what felt like an eternity. The only sounds were the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves and the sigh of the wind through the tall grass. The landscape was beautiful in a wild, untamed sort of way. Splashes of wildflowers painted the meadows in vibrant colors. Under different circumstances, she might have found peace here, but now it just felt empty, desolate. "Why did you do it?" she finally asked, her voice small against the vastness of the prairie. Garrett didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, and Hope thought he was going to ignore her. "Needed a wife," he said eventually. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Saw an opportunity." The words were like a slap. An opportunity. That's all she was. A solution to a problem. "Is that all I am to you? An opportunity?" The bitterness in her own voice surprised her. His chest rumbled against her back. It might have been a laugh, but it held no humor. "You asking if I'm some kind of scoundrel, Miss Miller?" "Mrs. Lawson, apparently," she shot back, a spark of her old Boston fire flaring to life. This time he did chuckle, a low, dark sound that she felt more than heard. "Fair point. No, I'm not a scoundrel. I need help on the ranch. Been running it alone since my pa died last winter." He paused, and his voice dropped even lower. "And no woman should be humiliated like that, standing up there while men decide if you're worth the trouble." She hadn't expected that. A flicker of something, maybe gratitude, warmed her. "Thank you. For that, at least." "Don't thank me yet," he said, his tone turning hard again. "Ranch life is rough. You might find yourself wishing I'd left you to that stagecoach." "I doubt that," she whispered, thinking of her cousin's cruel eyes and wandering hands. They crested a hill, and Garrett pulled the horse to a halt. Below them, nestled in a valley, was the Lawson Ranch. It wasn't what she expected. The house was modest but solid, built of dark timber. There was a large barn, several corrals, and pastures that stretched as far as the eye could see. A creek snaked through the property, its banks lined with cottonwood trees. It was isolated, terribly isolated. There wasn't another sign of human life for miles in any direction. "Lawson Ranch," Garrett said, and for the first time she heard a note of pride in his voice. "It's mine. Ours, I suppose." Hope's eyes were drawn to the house. It was simple, with a porch wrapping around two sides. But something was wrong. There was smoke rising from the chimney. "You have help?" she asked, a new unease prickling at her skin. He'd said he was running it alone. "Old Jim," Garrett said, "keeps an eye on things when I'm gone. He was my pa's friend, lives in the small cabin out back." As they rode down the hill, an elderly man emerged onto the porch. He was wiry and stooped, with a face like a dried apple. He watched them approach with an expression that was not welcoming. It was pure, undisguised suspicion. "Brought home more than supplies, I see," the old man called out, his voice a gravelly rasp. Garrett dismounted, then reached up to help Hope down. Her legs were shaky from the long ride, and she had to grip his arms to steady herself. For a fleeting moment they stood close, and she got her first real look at his face in the clear light. His eyes were even greener than she'd thought, with flecks of gold near the pupils. They were unsettlingly sharp. "Jim, this is Hope," Garrett said, stepping back and breaking the contact. "My wife." The old man's bushy eyebrows shot up to his hairline. "Wife? When in tarnation did this happen?" "About 3 hours ago," Garrett replied, his tone matter-of-fact. "She was Walter Jenkins's mail-order bride. He died before she got here." Jim's gaze shifted to Hope, and his weathered face didn't soften. It hardened. "Poor girl," he said, but his voice held no pity. It held a warning. "Well, you've landed on your feet, I suppose, even if this one here doesn't know the first thing about treating a lady." He shot Garrett a look that was less disapproval and more fear. "Sheriff Burke married us," Garrett said, a defensive edge to his voice. "That ain't a wedding. That's a business transaction," Jim scoffed. He tipped his hat to Hope, a gesture that felt more like a dismissal than a welcome. "Welcome to the Lawson Ranch, Mrs. Lawson. There's stew on. You must be hungry." He turned and shuffled back inside without another word. The screen door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. Garrett's jaw was tight. An unspoken tension crackled in the air between the two men. "He's protective," Garrett said, but it sounded like a lie. He led her inside. The main room was large, serving as a kitchen and living area. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall. It was clean, functional, but cold. It felt less like a home and more like a barracks. There were two doors leading off the main room. Both were closed. "It's not fancy," Garrett said, watching her face closely, "but it's solid." "It's lovely," Hope lied, forcing a smile. The stew was hearty, but Hope barely tasted it. The silence at the table was thick and suffocating. Jim ate with his head down, shoveling food into his mouth. Garrett said nothing, but Hope could feel his eyes on her, watching her every move. After the meal, Jim stood up abruptly. "Gotta check the fences," he muttered, not looking at either of them. He grabbed a rifle that was leaning by the door, and was gone, leaving Hope alone with her new husband. An awkward, heavy silence descended. "I'll show you your room," Garrett finally said, rising from the table. He led her not to one of the doors in the main room, but to a smaller one at the back of the house, almost hidden in the shadows. It was a simple room, furnished with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a washstand. A colorful quilt was folded neatly at the foot of the bed. "This was my mother's sewing room," he explained, his voice tight. "Made it into a guest room after she passed. Never had a guest, though." He hesitated in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the lamplight from the other room. "I'll sleep in the barn until we figure things out." "The barn?" Hope said, surprised. "You don't have to do that." "I do," he interrupted, his voice sharp, final. "We're strangers. A piece of paper from the sheriff doesn't change that." He looked at her, his green eyes unreadable in the dim light. "Get some rest. Tomorrow comes early." He pulled the door shut, and she heard the distinct sound of a key turning in a lock on the outside. Her blood ran cold. He had locked her in. Hope rushed to the door, her heart pounding. She twisted the knob. It didn't budge. She was a prisoner. She stumbled back, pressing herself against the far wall, her mind reeling. The auction, the possessive claim, the tense ride, Jim's strange hostility, and now this. This wasn't a marriage. It was a cage. She looked around the small room, her eyes darting into every corner. The single window was boarded up from the outside. There was no escape. Exhaustion and terror washed over her in a sickening wave. She sank onto the edge of the narrow bed, her mother's Bible clutched in her trembling hands. This morning she was a mail-order bride. Tonight she was a prisoner. And her quiet, intense husband, Garrett Lawson, was her jailer. Hope didn't sleep. How could she? Every creak of the old house, every rustle of wind outside her boarded-up window, sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. She sat on the bed, fully dressed, until the first pale fingers of dawn seeped through the cracks in the boards. She heard the sound of the key in the lock, and the door swung open. Garrett stood there, already dressed for the day. He looked as if he hadn't slept either. "There's coffee," he said, his voice flat. He didn't meet her eyes. Hope stood up, her legs stiff. She didn't say anything about the locked door. What was the point? It would only confirm her powerlessness. She would watch, she would wait, and she would find her moment. In the main room, Jim was already at the stove, frying bacon. He grunted a good morning in her direction, but his eyes were cold and wary. The tension between the two men was a living thing, a coiled snake in the middle of the room. "Been up since before dawn," Jim said, sliding a plate of eggs and bacon in front of her. "Spring calving season, busiest time of the year. Garrett's checking on a heifer." He said the words, but they felt rehearsed, an explanation for an absence that felt more like an escape. Hope ate in silence, forcing the food down her tight throat. She needed her strength. After the pretense of breakfast, Jim made another excuse about mending fences and disappeared, taking his rifle with him. She was alone with Garrett again. "I'm riding out," he said, pulling on a pair of leather gloves. "Checking the north pasture. Should be back by noon." He looked at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Stay close to the house." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. He left, and Hope watched him from the porch as he saddled his horse and rode away, a solitary figure against the vast, empty landscape. The moment he was out of sight, she began to move. She had to understand this place, this prison. She started with the house. It was just as he'd said, solid and functional. But it was also unnervingly bare. There were no pictures on the walls, no books on the shelves, no small personal touches that would make a house a home. It was the house of a man who was just passing through, not one who had lived here his whole life. The two doors in the main room were bedrooms. One was clearly Garrett's. It was as sparse as the rest of the house. A bed, a dresser, a few shirts hanging on pegs. The other room was empty, covered in a thin layer of dust. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. This was where the story didn't fit. He had put her in his mother's old sewing room, a tiny remote chamber at the back of the house. Why not this perfectly good guest room, unless he wanted her isolated, tucked away, easy to control? Her search grew more frantic. She looked for letters, for documents, for anything that might tell her who this man really was. She found nothing. It was as if Garrett Lawson had no past. Then she remembered the story from town. Walter Jenkins, her intended groom, had died in a riding accident, trampled by his own spooked horse. A freak accident. But Jim's words from yesterday came back to her. "That ain't a wedding. That's a business transaction." He hadn't just been cynical. He'd been trying to tell her something. She moved to the barn. It was huge and shadowy, smelling of hay and animals. Garrett's things were there, a bedroll and a saddlebag in a corner of the hayloft, proof that he had indeed slept here last night. She rummaged through the saddlebag, oiled cloths, a whetstone, a small pouch of tobacco, and at the very bottom, something hard and metallic. Her fingers closed around it. She pulled it out. It was a silver pocket watch. The back was engraved with a flowery, elegant script. Her heart stopped. She knew that engraving. She had seen it a dozen times. The initials were W.J. Walter Jenkins. Hope sank back into the hay, the cold metal of the watch biting into her palm. Her mind was a whirlwind of terrifying possibilities. Garrett had Walter's watch, a personal item, not something you'd find lying on the trail. This meant he had known him. He had been near him, possibly when he died. He had lied. He had stood in that town square and pretended to be a stranger, a simple rancher looking for a wife. It was all a lie. Freak accident, the sheriff had said. Hope's blood ran cold. What if it wasn't an accident at all? What if the man who now called himself her husband was the reason her intended groom was dead? She had to get out. She had to get back to town and tell the sheriff what she'd found. She scrambled down from the loft, her eyes darting towards the open barn door. She could see the house, the empty porch. She had time. She looked around the barn, her gaze falling on a second horse in one of the stalls. It was a gentle-looking mare. Garrett had said he would send someone for supplies. He must have another horse. She wasn't a rider, but she could learn. She had to learn. She found a bridle and saddle. Her hands fumbled with the straps, her fingers clumsy with fear. She thought of the riding lessons her father had paid for one summer, so many years ago. It felt like another lifetime. She led the mare out of the barn, keeping the large structure between her and the direction Garrett had ridden. She managed to get the saddle on, pulling the cinch as tight as she could. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Every second felt like an hour. She put her foot in the stirrup and hauled herself up. The horse shifted nervously but stood still. Hope grabbed the reins, her knuckles white. She looked back at the ranch house one last time. It wasn't a home. It was a trap. And she was a fool for walking right into it. She urged the horse forward into a clumsy trot, pointing it in the direction of the town. 10 miles, Garrett had said. It might as well have been 1,000. She had been riding for what felt like hours, the unfamiliar motion jarring her bones when she heard it. The sound of another horse coming up fast behind her. Panic seized her. She kicked the mare, urging it into a gallop. The horse responded, stretching its legs, but Hope knew it was no use. She was an amateur, and whoever was behind her was not. She glanced over her shoulder. It was him. Garrett was closing the distance with terrifying speed, his face a mask of cold fury. He wasn't just chasing her. He was hunting her. She had made a terrible mistake. She shouldn't have run. She should have waited, played the part of the obedient wife. Now he knew. He knew she suspected something. He caught up to her easily, grabbing her horse's bridle and yanking it to a sudden, brutal halt. Her mare reared up, and Hope screamed, clinging to the saddle horn to keep from being thrown. Garrett dismounted in one smooth motion and was at her side, his hand clamping around her arm like a manacle. He pulled her from the horse. "Where do you think you're going?" he snarled, his green eyes blazing with a fire that chilled her to the bone. "Let go of me!" she cried, struggling against his grip. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice dangerously low. He dragged her towards his own horse. "We have a lot to talk about, wife." He lifted her and threw her over his saddle like a sack of flour. Before she could react, he was on the horse behind her, his arm a steel band around her waist, holding her in place. He turned the horse and rode not back towards the ranch, but deeper into the wilderness, away from the trail, away from any hope of rescue. She had thought she was a prisoner before. She was wrong. Before, she had been a captive. Now she was a hostage, and her captor was a man who had lied, a man who had stolen from the dead, and who she was now certain was a cold-blooded killer. He didn't take her back to the ranch. Instead, he rode them high into the rocky foothills, to a place so remote and desolate it felt like the edge of the world. He stopped at a small, dilapidated line shack, a one-room cabin meant for cowboys caught in a storm. He pulled her off the horse and shoved her inside. The cabin was dark and smelled of damp earth and old smoke. There was a rough-hewn table, a single chair, and a cold fireplace. Nothing else. "Sit," he commanded, pointing to the chair. Hope remained standing, her chin lifted in defiance. She would not make this easy for him. His eyes narrowed. He took a step towards her, and she flinched back despite herself. He stopped, a muscle working in his jaw. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration that seemed out of place on such a controlled man. "I'm not going to hurt you, Hope," he said, his voice softer now, but no less intense. "You locked me in my room," she accused, her voice trembling but clear. "You lied to me. You have Walter Jenkins's watch." The accusations hung in the dusty air between them. He didn't look surprised. He just looked tired. "Yes," he said, "I lied. And yes, this was his." He pulled the watch from his own pocket and tossed it onto the table. It landed with a heavy clink. "So you admit it," she breathed, her worst fears confirmed. "You knew him. You killed him, didn't you? You killed him and you took his watch. Garrett stared at her, his green eyes searching her face. I knew him, he admitted, but I didn't kill him. Not the way you think. What other way is there? She shot back. Walter Jenkins wasn't a shopkeeper, Hope, he said slowly, his words dropping into the silence like stones into a deep well. He was a liar and a monster. The store was a front. His real business was women. Hope stared at him, confused. What are you talking about? The mail-order bride arrangement. It was a scam. He'd lure women out here from the East. Women with no family. No one to look for them. Women like you. He'd promise them marriage, a new life. Garrett's face was grim. But there was no marriage. He'd take their dowry and then he would sell them. To saloons in mining camps. To men who would use them up and throw them away. Hope felt the blood drain from her face. It couldn't be true. The letters from Walter had been so kind, so respectable. You're lying, she whispered. You're trying to save your own skin. Am I? He asked. He took another step closer, and this time she didn't move. Think about it, Hope. A freak accident. A perfectly sound horse suddenly spooking and trampling its owner to death just 3 days before his new bride arrives? Does that sound like a coincidence to you? He was right. It had seemed too convenient, too neat. The sheriff knows, Garrett continued. We've been watching Jenkins for months. We knew he was expecting you. We had to stop him before you got here. You and the sheriff? Hope was struggling to process the flood of information. So his death, it wasn't an accident. No, Garrett said quietly. It wasn't. It was justice. The word hung in the air. Justice. It was a cold and brutal word. But why? Hope asked, her mind racing. Why me? Why did you claim me at the auction? Because Jenkins's partners are still out there, he said, his voice urgent now. They were expecting you. They knew you were coming. When you didn't show up at the stagecoach as Jenkins's fiancé, they would have started asking questions. They would have come looking for you. They'd assume you knew something about their operation. It all started to click into place, a horrifying puzzle assembling itself in her mind. The auction, the public spectacle. It was a show, she breathed, to hide me. To hide you in plain sight, he confirmed. If you were married to a local rancher, just another mail-order bride whose intended had died, no one would look twice. I could take you out to the ranch, keep you safe, until we could round up the rest of the gang. The locked door, the boarded window. It wasn't to keep her in, it was to keep them out. Jim's hostility. He wasn't afraid of Garrett. He was afraid for her. But they're still out there? She asked, a new kind of fear creeping in. This danger was real, not just a suspicion. Yes, and they're getting desperate, Garrett said. My guess is they've been watching the town, waiting. Your little ride this morning probably got their attention. They'll know something is wrong. They might think you're trying to get to the sheriff. He looked at her, his expression grim. They'll be coming, not to town. They'll come to the one place they know to find you. The ranch, she whispered. He nodded. We have to get back. Jim's there alone. Suddenly, the dynamic shifted. He was no longer her captor. He was her protector. The fear she felt for him was replaced by a different fear. A fear for him, for Jim, for herself. Garrett picked up the pocket watch from the table and held it out to her. Jenkins dropped this during our conversation. I picked it up as proof. I was going to tell you everything, Hope. Once it was safe, I swear it. She looked from the watch to his face. The cold fury was gone, replaced by a deep, weary sincerity. She saw the truth in his eyes. She believed him. Okay, she said, her voice steady. What do we do? A flicker of relief crossed his face. We ride, and we fight. He helped her onto his horse, swinging up behind her. This time, when his arms came around her, it didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a shield. They rode hard and fast, the wind whipping at their faces. Hope leaned back against Garrett's chest, drawing strength from his solid presence. The world had been turned upside down in the space of a few hours. The man she thought was a killer was her only hope. The home she thought was a prison was now a fortress under siege. And Walter Jenkins, the man who had promised her a respectable life, had been a demon who would have sold her into a living hell. As they crested the last hill overlooking the valley, Garrett pulled the horse to a stop. He didn't have to say anything. She saw them, too. 3 riders, sitting on their horses at the edge of the cottonwood trees by the creek. They were watching the ranch house, waiting. "They're here," she whispered. "I know," Garrett replied, his voice a low, dangerous growl. His arm tightened around her. "Stay behind me, no matter what happens." The fight for her life, a life she had only just gotten back, was about to begin. The plan was simple and desperate. "I'll circle around through the trees," Garrett murmured, his voice tight with tension. "Come up behind the barn. You're going to ride straight for the house, as fast as you can. Don't stop for anything. You hear me?" Hope nodded, her throat too dry to speak. "When they see you, they'll come for you. That's when I'll have my shot." He was going to use her as bait. The realization was cold and sharp, but there was no fear in it, only a grim acceptance. This was the role she had to play. He slid off the back of the horse. "Jim will be inside. He'll be ready." He looked at her, his green eyes boring into hers. "You can do this, Hope." He slapped the horse's rump, and the animal surged forward, galloping down the hill towards the ranch house. Just as Garrett predicted, the moment she broke from the cover of the hill, the 3 riders by the creek spurred their horses. They moved to intercept her, their dark figures growing larger and more menacing with every passing second. Hope flattened herself against the horse's neck, urging it on, the wind screaming in her ears. The house seemed impossibly far away. The riders were closing in, fanning out to cut off her path. She could hear them shouting now, their voices lost in the thunder of the hooves. Then, a crack of a rifle shot echoed from the direction of the barn. One of the riders jerked in his saddle and fell, his horse veering away in panic. 2 left. The front door of the ranch house flew open, and she saw Jim, his old rifle raised to his shoulder. Another shot rang out, and a second rider cried out, clutching his arm, but he didn't fall. They were almost on her. The remaining rider and the wounded one were converging. She could see the rage and desperation on their faces. Suddenly, Garrett was there, riding out from behind the barn, his own rifle in his hands. He was a whirlwind of controlled violence, a specter of vengeance rising from the dust. He fired from the saddle. The wounded man slumped forward and slid to the ground. Only one left. The last rider ignored Garrett. His eyes were fixed on Hope. He was reaching for her, his face twisted in a snarl. She was his prize, his only way out of this. Her horse stumbled, and Hope was thrown, landing hard on the dusty ground. The impact knocked the wind out of her. She looked up, dazed, to see the last rider dismounting, a long knife flashing in his hand. He was coming for her. Garrett was too far away. Jim was reloading. This was it. The man loomed over her, his shadow falling across her face. He raised the knife. A deafening blast exploded right next to her ear. The man's eyes went wide with shock. A dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. He staggered backward and collapsed in a heap, the knife falling from his lifeless fingers. Hope pushed herself up, her ears ringing. Old Jim was standing over her, his smoking rifle held at his side. He hadn't been reloading. He had been moving. "No one messes with our girl," he rasped, and for the first time he gave her a genuine gap-toothed smile. Garrett galloped up, leaping from his horse before it had even stopped. He rushed to her side, his face a mask of concern. "Are you hurt? Hope, are you hurt?" He helped her to her feet, his hands checking her for injuries. "I'm all right," she said, her voice shaky. "I'm all right." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. She buried her face in his dusty shirt, the smell of leather and gunpowder filling her senses. She was safe. It was over. They stood there for a long moment, the silence of the valley broken only by the sound of their own ragged breathing. Jim cleared his throat. "Well," he said, nudging one of the bodies with the toe of his boot, "reckon the trash has been taken out." Garrett finally released her, though he kept a hand on her arm, as if afraid she might disappear. "We need to get them to the sheriff." That night, after the bodies had been taken to town and the full story told to a grim-faced Sheriff Burke, the three of them sat at the kitchen table. The silence was different this time. It wasn't heavy or awkward. It was peaceful. Hope had cleaned and bandaged a shallow graze on Garrett's arm, the only injury he'd sustained. The physical contact was easy, natural. Everything had changed. Jim finished his coffee and stood up. "Think I'll turn in," he said, stretching his weary bones. He paused at the door and looked at Hope. "You're good for him, girl. You got grit." He nodded at Garrett. "Don't you mess this up, boy." With that, he was gone, leaving them alone once more. Garrett watched her from across the table, his green eyes soft in the lamplight. "He's right, you know," he said quietly. "You have grit. I saw it the first moment I laid eyes on you, standing on that platform. You were terrified, but you weren't broken. You stood there with so much pride, so much strength. I knew then." "You knew what?" she whispered. "That my plan to just protect a witness had gotten a lot more complicated," he admitted, a small, wry smile touching his lips. "I told myself it was just a duty, that I was doing the sheriff a favor. But it was a lie. I wanted you, Hope, from that first second." He stood up and walked around the table, stopping in front of her. He gently took her hands, his calloused thumbs stroking her skin. "I'm sorry for how this all started," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry I had to lie to you, to scare you. It was the only way I knew to keep you safe." "You did keep me safe," she said, looking up at him. "You saved my life." "I want more than that," he said, his gaze intense. "I want to give you a life, a real one, here, with me. I want this to be a real marriage, Hope, if you'll still have me." Hope's heart felt like it would burst. This man, this quiet, dangerous, honorable man, had risked everything for her. He had seen her at her lowest, and had seen strength, not weakness. She stood up, her hands still in his. "I thought I came west to marry a respectable shopkeeper," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "But I think I'd much rather be married to a scoundrel who fights for justice." The smile that broke across his face was like the sun rising over the mountains. It transformed him, chasing away all the shadows. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It wasn't a tentative, uncertain kiss, like she might have imagined. It was a kiss full of promise, of relief, of a future that had been fought for and won. It was the kiss of a man who had come home. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "I should warn you," he murmured. "I'm not a man of fancy words." "You don't need them," she whispered, touching his cheek. "Just be you." That night, Garrett didn't go to the barn. He moved his few belongings into the main bedroom, their bedroom. The house no longer felt like a barracks or a prison. It felt like a beginning. It felt like home. As they stood on the porch, watching the first stars appear in the vast, dark sky, he wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest. "I claimed you in that square," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "I told them you were mine forever." Hope leaned back into his embrace, a feeling of pure, unadulterated peace settling over her. "And I am?" she said softly. "I am entirely yours." They had been brought together by a lie, surrounded by death and deception. But in the heart of the wild, unforgiving West, these two strangers had found something true, a partnership, a home, a love as solid and enduring as the mountains that watched over them. They had faced the darkness together and won, and their story was just beginning. If you enjoyed this tale of courage and justice on the frontier, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You never know what other strange and mysterious stories are hiding out there in the Wild West.